A Perkins engine would start on a cold morning when nothing else would, and if you grew up anywhere near a farm, you know that sound. At its peak, the Eastfield works in Peterborough employed 10,500 people and built engines for a fifth of the world's tractors, exported to 171 countries. They survived the Depression, survived the war, survived a fuel tax that nearly destroyed them in their third year, and a strike that shut the gates for months. They adapted, retooled, and kept building. And then, after more than 60 years of making, Peterborough came within months of losing it all. How does the most profitable engine works in Britain end up fighting for its own survival? What happened inside those walls? Chapter 1. 2 rooms on Queen Street, Peterborough, in the summer of 1932 was a cathedral city of 45,000 souls, perched between the fens and the southern edge of the Midlands, with an economy built on precision engineering, food machinery, and the railway. The Great Depression had hollowed out Britain's motor trade. Factories were closing, and on Queen Street, in the vacant ground-floor rooms of an ironworks that had belonged to his own family for 3 generations, a man with a ginger moustache and a fresh flower in his lapel was preparing to build something that shouldn't have worked. Francis Arthur Perkins, Frank to everyone who knew him, was born in Peterborough on the 20th of February, 1889. He was a tall, erect, well-built man, always eccentric, always immaculate, the grandson of Thomas Perkins of Hitchin, the son of John Edward Sharman Perkins, whose family firm Barford and Perkins had once been among the city's proudest names. Rugby School, then Gresham's, then Emmanuel College, Cambridge, where he scraped a pass degree in mechanical engineering in 1910, a Royal Engineers major in the First World War, a man who moved through a room the way men of his class and generation did, with certainty, with volume, with a kind of patrician confidence that could charm a boardroom or flatten a meeting, depending on his mood. His business partner was his opposite in almost every measurable dimension. Charles Wallace Chapman was born in Lancaster on the 4th of August, 1897, 8 years younger, a foot shorter, and from an entirely different world. Lancaster Royal Grammar School, not rugby. The Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, not the Royal Engineers. An apprenticeship at Vickers in Barrow, then a master's degree in engineering from Liverpool. Where Frank was the salesman, the front of house, the man whose presence filled a room, Chapman was roughly 5'4", 10 stone, studious, quiet, and possessed of an engineering mind that would change the shape of the 20th century. Contemporaries who knew them both described the contrast in terms that needed no embellishment. The larger-than-life and overbearing Perkins, and the diminutive genius who let his drawings do the talking. They'd met around 1929 at Aveling and Porter in Rochester, Kent, both employed by agricultural and general engineers, the sprawling, doomed conglomerate known as Age that had swallowed Frank's family firm in 1920 and was now lurching towards insolvency. When Age collapsed in 1932, it took their jobs with it. But before the receivers had finished counting the furniture, the 2 men sat down at Chapman's house in Strood and sketched the outline of a small diesel engine on a sheet of paper. The drive back to the railway station nearly killed them. Their car was written off in a head-on collision with a lorry. Both men walked away. The engine they'd sketched would eventually power a fifth of the world's tractors. To understand what Chapman proposed, you have to understand what diesel meant in 1932. The diesel engine was a German curiosity, heavy, slow revving, associated with U-boats, ocean liners, and stationary generators the size of garden sheds. Nobody serious believed you could make one small enough, light enough, and responsive enough to drop into a car or a van. The problem was ignition. In a petrol engine, a spark plug does the work. In a diesel, the fuel must ignite under compression alone, and at the speeds required for a road vehicle, the combustion window shrank to roughly 1,000th of a second. Too slow, and the engine coughed and died. Too uneven, and it shook itself apart. Chapman's solution was elegant and specific. A pre-combustion chamber fitted with what he called a pin-toe injector, a development of the standard Pintle injector with an additional air hole that atomized the diesel spray so finely that ignition could occur within that 1,000th of a second window. He called the system the Perkins Aeroflow. It remained in production use for more than 40 years. On the 7th of June 1932, the company was formally registered. F. Perkins Limited. Capital, £10,000. Directors, Frank Perkins, Charles Chapman, the Age veteran solicitor, George Dodds Perks, and Frank's brother-in-law, Captain Alan Richardson. Employees, 3. Premises, 2 ground-floor rooms in the derelict Queen Street Ironworks, rented cheaply because nobody else wanted them, and the landlord's surname was already on the building. The first engine, a 4-cylinder prototype Chapman called the Vixen, was started on a Saturday evening in autumn 1932. The combustion caps had to be heated red hot in a coke stove and screwed into the engine block by hand before the thing would fire. There were cheers when it caught, and when the needle climbed past 4,000 revolutions per minute, a speed no diesel engine had ever sustained, the cheers became something closer to disbelief. That night, in a corner of a derelict Peterborough ironworks, with 3 employees and a prototype held together by ingenuity and coke stove heat, the modern diesel passenger car was born. They built 35 engines in their first full year. Chapter 2. The Wolf, the Panther and Brooklands. The Vixen was a proof of concept. What followed was a crash course in commercial survival. Chapman enlarged the Vixen's bore from 75mm to 85, adding 30% more torque, and rechristened the result, the Wolf. The redesign wasn't speculative. It was a direct response to conversations between Frank Perkins and Thomas Keep, the managing director of Commer Cars, the truck division of the Roots Group. Keep needed a diesel small enough and light enough for his medium-duty lorries. Chapman built him one. Commer became the first original equipment manufacturer to fit a Perkins engine as standard, and in doing so established the business model that would define the company for the next 90 years. Perkins didn't sell engines to the public. It sold engines to the people who built machines for the public. Close customer integration, bespoke engineering, quiet ubiquity. The engine in the thing you bought, not the thing itself. The wolf begat the lynx begat the leopard. All 4-cylinder, all refined iterations of Chapman's Aeroflow combustion system, each one a little more powerful, a little more reliable, a little closer to the engine the market didn't yet know it needed. And in 1937, Chapman produced his masterpiece, a 6-cylinder engine so clean in its design that it went from first drawing to approved production prototype in 5.5 months. Right first time, 50 years before the phrase was coined. Originally, he wanted to call it the Panther, until the Phelan and Moore Motorcycle Company, makers of the Panther motorbike, threatened legal action. Perkins abandoned animal names altogether after that. The engine became the P6, and its designation system, first digit for cylinders, a letter or number for displacement, would define the company's product line for the next quarter-century. But between the Vixen's first firing in 1932 and the P6 arrival in 1937, the company nearly died. In 1935, the government imposed a tax on diesel fuel. The logic was fiscal. Diesel had been untaxed, giving it a price advantage over petrol that the Treasury wanted to close. The effect on a small Peterborough firm trying to convince British lorry operators to switch from petrol to diesel was devastating. Orders slowed. The economics of the diesel proposition, already marginal for skeptical fleet buyers, tilted back towards petrol. Perkins survived because a wealthy backer, never fully identified in the public record, simply paid the bills while Chapman kept refining the engines and Frank kept selling them. What saved the order book was the sea. Marine operators didn't care about road fuel duty. They cared about range, about reliability, and above all, about fire. A petrol engine on a wooden boat was a floating bomb, one fuel leak near a hot exhaust manifold, and the whole vessel went up. A diesel was inherently safer, its fuel far less volatile, its exhaust cooler. By the end of 1934, 150 Marine Wolf engines had been sold, with both the Admiralty and the Air Ministry showing interest. The company had found its first dependable revenue stream, not in the trucks and cars Chapman had originally designed for, but in the boats and launches that needed what diesel offered most, the ability to run hard without catching fire. In October 1935, Frank Perkins took 6 world diesel speed records at Brooklands, the banked concrete circuit in Surrey, where everything that mattered in British motorsport was proved or broken. The fastest run touched 95 miles per hour, for a diesel, in 1935. The records didn't just validate Chapman's engineering. They gave Frank what he needed most, a story to sell. The tall man in the tweed suit could now walk into any fleet operator's office in Britain and say, with evidence, that his engines were the fastest diesels on Earth. By 1936, production had reached 556 engines a year. By 1938, the company turned its first profit, filling orders for nearly 2,000 engines annually. And then the war came. The marinized diesel that had saved the company commercially now saved it strategically. With war declared in September 1939, the Ministry of Supply tasked Perkins with producing engines for the Royal Navy and the Air Ministry's Marine section, specifically for high-speed planing craft, where petrol fires were not a nuisance, but a death sentence. Chapman developed the S6 from his P6 in just 4 months, pushing output from 100 to 120 brake horsepower without adding weight. The engines went into air-sea rescue launches, seaplane tenders, motor torpedo boats, and the small auxiliary craft that kept the coastal war running. About 5,500 P6 engines were built during the war years, roughly 3,000 of them for marine use. The Royal Yacht Britannia's Royal Barge carried a Perkins P6. So did HMS Stickleback and her 3 sister midget submarines. So did the entire 38-boat fleet of the Thames River Police. Chapman himself didn't stay to see the wartime production peak. He resigned from the board in November 1942. The reasons were never made fully public, though those close to the company attributed the break to disagreements over how his designs were being used and credited. He spent the rest of the war on Air Ministry work and never returned to the firm that bore his partner's name. In the 1951 flotation, Chapman received £16,100 for his original 1,000 shares. The Perkins family received $387,000. The diminutive genius who'd invented the Aeroflow, designed the Vixen, the Wolf, the P6 and the S6, walked away with roughly 4% of what the salesman's family took home. He died in Winchelsea, East Sussex, in December 1979, aged 82, having spent his later career running a coupling company that was eventually absorbed into GKN. His name appears nowhere on the building. Chapter 3. The Cathedral of British Diesel. The Queen Street Works couldn't hold what was coming. Cramped between the East Coast Main Line and the cathedral, the original ironworks had served well enough for 3 employees and a coke stove. But post-war demand was running at a pace the Victorian buildings couldn't absorb. Construction of a new factory on greenfield land at Eastfield, on the eastern edge of the city, began roughly a month after VE Day in 1945. The site was enormous, open ground adjacent to the showground, with room to build at a scale that Queen Street could never have accommodated. The Eastfield headquarters plant opened in 1947. By 1948, it was producing 100 engines every working day. Above the main entrance, carved into the stonework in letters large enough to read from the road, was Frank Perkins's adopted motto from the Book of Proverbs: "Where there is no vision, the people perish." It remains there today. 90-odd years after the company was founded, 70-odd years after the factory opened, through every ownership change and every redundancy exercise and every corporate rebrand that followed, nobody has taken it down, and nobody has suggested they should. Walking onto the Eastfield floor in those early post-war years would have hit you first through sound. The continuous low thunder of test cells running engines to destruction, layered over the percussive clatter of the machine shop, where cylinder blocks were bored and honed to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Then smell, cutting fluid, a sharp mineral tang that clung to overalls and hair and stayed with you on the bus home. Hot metal from the foundry where iron was poured, and underneath it all, the particular oily warmth of a diesel engine running on a test bed, a smell halfway between a lorry depot and a working farm. The floor itself vibrated. Not dramatically, you got used to it inside a week, but constantly, a low-frequency hum transmitted through concrete and steel from hundreds of engines in various stages of assembly, test and dispatch. A new starter's soles would tingle for the first few days. Old hands didn't notice it any more than they noticed breathing. By the early 1950s, Eastfield was producing 25,000 engines a year, with 2,850 staff. In 1953, the Queen Mother visited the factory for the company's 21st birthday celebrations. 21 years since that Saturday evening with the coke stove and the Vixen. Frank Perkins, 64 years old and still wearing the flower in his lapel, was photographed behind the wheel of a tractor with his wife Gwyneth beside him. That same year, the firm floated on the London Stock Exchange, and Simpson and Company of India became the first overseas licensee, a model that would eventually extend Perkins Engines to 171 countries through more than 3,500 distributor outlets. The numbers that followed were the kind that made other engine manufacturers study their own order books with quiet alarm. By 1953, F. Perkins Ltd was the largest manufacturer of diesel engines in the world, producing 60,000 a year with almost 9,000 employees. By the late 1950s, 75,000 engines were leaving Peterborough annually, and the workforce had passed 7,000 on that single site alone. What made Eastfield different from a dozen other British engine works wasn't just the volume, it was the range. Chapman's Aeroflow system and its successors could be scaled up or down across families of 2, 3, 4 and 6-cylinder engines, each one sharing common design principles, but tailored to wildly different applications. A Perkins engine could power a London black cab, a Massey Ferguson tractor, a Vermeer trencher, a JCB backhoe, a Clark forklift, a Manitou telehandler, an Israeli taxi, a Thames River launch, or a Caterpillar generator set. The company's entire commercial model depended on this versatility. 600 OEM customers worldwide, each one receiving an engine configured for their specific application, tested against their specific duty cycle, supported by Perkins's own global parts network. It was bespoke manufacturing at industrial scale, and it all ran through Eastfield. The engine families that emerged under the standardized Massey Ferguson era nomenclature, first digit for cylinders, second number for cubic inch displacement, became the vocabulary of post-war agricultural and industrial diesel. The 6.3 54, a straight 6 5.7-litre flagship, arrived in 1960. One was painted gold to mark Perkins's millionth export engine in 1962, and it stayed in production for more than 30 years. The 4.108 and its sibling, the 4.107, became marine and light industrial favourites, small enough for a yacht's engine bay, tough enough for a circumnavigation. Chapter 4. One engine in every 5. In 1959, Frank Perkins made the decision that would define the next 4 decades. Squeezed by the aftershocks of the Suez fuel crisis and the troubled development of a new engine called the R6, he sold a majority stake in the company to its largest customer, the Canadian agricultural giant Massey Ferguson, for £4.5 million. He was 70 years old. He'd built the company from 2 rooms and 3 employees to the largest diesel engine manufacturer in the world. And on his final day as managing director, after 37 years, the entire shop floor turned out to sing, "For he's a jolly good fellow." He stayed on as chairman until 1962, was made a freeman of Peterborough that year, and died at his home, Alwalton Hall, on the 15th of October 1967, aged 78. He is commemorated in Alwalton Parish Church, the same church, a few hundred yards down the road, that contains a memorial plaque to Henry Royce, 2 of Britain's great engine pioneers, buried within walking distance of each other in a Cambridgeshire village. Under Massey Ferguson, Perkins didn't just grow. It became, for a generation of farmers and operators on every continent, the default answer to the question of what powered the machines that worked the land. The engine that came to embody that dominance was the 3-cylinder AD3 152, fitted as standard to the Massey Ferguson 135, arguably the most universally recognised tractor in the world, and certainly the most loved. Over its 14-year production run at Coventry between 1965 and 1979, 413,153 MF135s rolled off the line. The tractor was small, reliable, cheap to maintain, and essentially indestructible in the hands of farmers who understood that a diesel engine asked only for clean fuel, clean oil, and the patience to let it warm up on a cold morning. Farming folklore calls it the best tractor ever made. The second-hand market, 60 years later, confirms the verdict. A working MF 135 with a sound Perkins 3-cylinder still commands serious money at farm sales across Britain, Ireland and Africa. The tractor was, in almost every meaningful sense, a steel shell wrapped around a Perkins engine. But the 135 wasn't even the biggest seller in the family. The 4.236, a 4-cylinder, 3.9-litre workhorse that rolled off the Eastfield line for the first time in August 1964, powered 4.5 million machines in its 30-year production run. More than 2 million 4.236 engines were built at Peterborough alone. It went into Volvo trucks in Scandinavia, badged as the D39. It powered the Checker Marathon, that angular yellow taxi you'd have flagged down on a New York street in 1969. It drove Dodge 50 Series lorries across Britain from 1979 to 1987. Hyundai License built it in South Korea as the HD4236 for their Bison trucks. It powered JCB diggers, Manitou telehandlers, Landini tractors, and a Brazilian sports car called the Puma that looked nothing like anything you'd associate with a diesel engine. 4.5 million machines, one engine family, one factory in Peterborough. Annual production climbed to 200,000 engines in 1964, the year the Queen's Award for Export Achievement arrived, 2 years after the millionth export engine had been painted gold and paraded through the works. By the mid-1970s, a single shift at Eastfield could produce 1,500 diesel engines in a day. At its peak, the Peterborough site employed around 10,500 people, a figure that represented not just a factory, but an economy, a social structure, a way of life that shaped the eastern edge of the city as completely as the cathedral shaped the centre. The community that formed around Eastfield had the texture of every major British works town, but with a distinctive Perkins character. The sports and social ground on Newark Road hosted cricket, football, and the annual works outing. The Perkins Long Service Club, founded around 1962, held its Diamond Jubilee in 2022. Open today to any employee with 10 years' service, it still runs an annual dinner in May, conservation work, and day trips. Stephen Parry, a Perkins accountant who served 30 years and later gave an oral history to the Hitchin Historical Society, described a company that even at 20,000 employees worldwide in the late 1970s was a family company. A Brazilian colleague of Parry's put it more simply, La Familia Perkins. The adventurers, too, chose Perkins. Sir Francis Chichester carried a Perkins 4107 marine engine aboard Gypsy Moth A4. Che Blythe used the same engine type in British steel on his 1971-72 solo non-stop westward circumnavigation, the first time anyone had sailed alone around the world against the prevailing winds and currents. David Scott Cowper relied on Perkins marine power twice in the 1980s. These weren't sponsorship deals or marketing stunts. These were men who needed an engine that would start in the Southern Ocean at 3 in the morning and not stop until they reached home. They chose Perkins because the engines worked. The only shadow across this golden age fell in 1973, when thousands of Perkins workers took strike action in a dispute that lasted several months and left, by the Peterborough Telegraph's own assessment, nobody a winner. A photograph survives of the mass meeting that year. A sea of faces on the car park, a forest of raised hands. The precise grievances have faded from the public record, but the image remains, a reminder that even at its peak, Eastfield was a place where the pressures of industrial life, wages, conditions, the eternal tension between management prerogative and shop floor dignity, ran as hot as the test cells. Chapter 5. The Summit Before the Storm. By 1975, 500,000 Perkins engines were being built in a single year, counting Peterborough, the subsidiary plants, and the licensees, spanning 15 countries. The company's own corporate materials claimed that at peak, 1 in 5 of the world's tractors carried a Perkins diesel. No independent industry audit has ever verified the figure precisely, but nobody in the trade press has seriously disputed it either. From Lincolnshire to Lagos, from the Punjab to Patagonia, the sound of a Perkins four-cylinder turning over on a cold morning was the sound of agriculture itself. Frank Perkins, had he lived to see it, would have recognized the achievement and understood its fragility. The dual carriageway carrying traffic past the Eastfield site had been renamed Frank Perkins Parkway in his honor, a strip of tarmac connecting the factory he'd founded to the city he'd grown up in. A few miles away, in Alwalton Parish Church, his memorial plaque sat near Henry Royce's. 2 men, born a generation apart, who'd each understood that an engine is not a product, but a promise, that the machine it powers will start when you need it and keep running until the work is done. The Eastfield Works in the mid-1970s was a place of extraordinary confidence. Production records were being broken. The 4.236 was being fitted to machines on every continent. The workforce had never been larger. Rolls-Royce diesels of Shrewsbury would be acquired in 1984, L. Gardner and Sons of Patricroft in 1986, the famous Manchester firm whose name had once been synonymous with premium British commercial vehicle diesel. Perkins was expanding into the supply chains of the world's largest equipment manufacturers and winning. A development contract with Austin Rover produced the Prima, the first high-speed diesel engine capable of 100 miles per hour and 100 miles per gallon, fitted to the Maestro, the Montego, and the Sherpa van. And yet the ground beneath all of it was already shifting. Because Perkins didn't belong to itself anymore. It belonged to Massey Ferguson. And Massey Ferguson, in the late 1970s, was walking towards the edge of a cliff that would produce the worst corporate loss in Canadian history. A fall so devastating that it would take 3 restructurings, 2 renamings, a Supreme Court case, and the better part of 2 decades to resolve. The most valuable diesel engine operation in Britain was about to become a hostage inside a company that was bleeding to death. The motto carved above the Eastfield door read, "Where there is no vision, the people perish." The people who'd carved it there couldn't have known how precisely it would apply, not to Perkins, which never lost its vision, but to the parent company that owned it, which had lost everything except the ability to sell the one thing that still worked. Chapter 6. The Chimney Sweep's Son. To understand how the most valuable diesel engine operation in Britain came to spend 2 decades trapped inside a dying parent, you need to understand the man who was trying to save both. Victor Arthur Rice was born in Hitchin, Hertfordshire, a market town 30 miles south of Peterborough, the son of Albert Rice, a chimney sweep. He left school at 16 and took his first job in the mailroom at Ford Motor Company's Dagenham plant. Mailroom to comptroller to chief executive is a trajectory that reads like a novel, but Rice made it in a straight line through sheer operational competence. By 1970, aged 35, he was comptroller of North European operations for the Perkins diesel engines subsidiary, running the numbers at the very factory this story is about. By 1975, he was in Toronto, working for the parent. By the end of the decade, he was the man the banks would turn to when Massey Ferguson began its long, public collapse. The collapse began with tractors, not engines. In 1979, the global farm machinery market fell off a cliff. Interest rates spiked. Commodity prices cratered. Farmers who'd borrowed to buy new equipment couldn't service the debt, and the manufacturers who'd lent them the money to buy it found themselves holding billions in receivables that would never be collected. Massey Ferguson, which had built its empire on exactly this model, selling tractors on credit to farmers worldwide, was catastrophically exposed. The 1978 loss came in at $262 million. The Washington Post reported it as the largest corporate loss not merely in Massey Ferguson history, but in Canadian history. The company that owned Perkins was haemorrhaging money at a rate that threatened to drag everything, the tractor plants, the combine works, the engine factories, the global distribution network, into insolvency. Conrad Black, the Argus Corporation chief who had taken effective control of Massey Ferguson in 1978, looked at the wreckage and made a calculation that would define his reputation for pragmatism, depending on your view or abandonment. In October 1980, he donated Argus's 16.5% controlling stake to the Massey Ferguson pension funds. He walked away. He'd decided the company was not worth saving at the price required, and the cleanest exit was to hand the problem to the pensioners and leave. That manoeuvre cleared the field for the rescue that followed. On the 7th of February 1981, Canadian Industry Minister Herb Gray announced that the federal government would guarantee loans of up to $125 million, while Ontario would provide roughly $75 million, a combined $200 million Canadian dollars in loan guarantees. The UK Export Credit's Guarantee Department added its own support. Roughly 140 international banks and insurers were corralled into a recapitalisation that Rice and his treasurer Neil Arnold privately called Project Sunshine. The name was darkly apt. They were trying to find daylight inside a building that was on fire. A Harvard Business School case study from 1980, written while the rescue was still being assembled, contained a sentence that would echo through the next 18 years of Perkins's corporate life. The engine division was described as Massey Ferguson's most valuable saleable asset, but at the same time, diesel engines were the company's best hope for profitable future growth. That tension, sell the jewel to pay the debts, or keep the jewel to rebuild the business, was never resolved. It simply persisted, year after year, restructuring after restructuring, while the people on the Eastfield floor kept building engines and wondering which morning would bring the announcement that the parent had finally done the arithmetic and decided to let them go. Chapter 7. Project Sunshine and the Spreadsheet Kingdom. The rescue bought time. It did not buy health. Through the early 1980s, Massey Ferguson's agricultural divisions continued to bleed. Rice's response was surgical. Strip the parent down to its profitable core, shed the loss makers, and concentrate what remained into a leaner entity that the capital markets might eventually believe in. The human cost at Peterborough was immediate and unprecedented. Engine production at Eastfield fell from over 200,000 per year at the start of the decade to around 130,000. For the first time in the company's history, Perkins workers faced compulsory redundancy, short-time working, 3-day weeks, reduced shifts. The particular anxiety of not knowing whether Monday's shift would be your last became a feature of life at the factory. The 50th anniversary celebrations in 1982 were, by every contemporary account, muted. What made the situation so corrosive was not that Perkins was failing. Perkins was profitable. The Eastfield Works was still building engines that 600 OEM customers wanted to buy, still exporting to 171 countries, still turning a margin that any standalone diesel manufacturer would have envied. The corrosion came from above, from a parent whose debts, accumulated across failed tractor finance programs and collapsing agricultural markets on 3 continents, were being serviced in part by the cash that Perkins generated. In 1985, Rice launched Project Sunshine 2. The name recycled the optimism. The mechanics were harder to admire. Loss-making divisions were hived off into a new entity called Massey Combines Corporation, and employees of those divisions were induced to transfer their benefits and pensions to the new company. Massey Combines collapsed 2 years later. The employees who'd transferred lost their pension protections. The case that followed, Verity Corporation v. Howe, reached the United States Supreme Court in 1996, where the justices held that Verity had committed a breach of fiduciary duty under the federal ERISA pension law by inducing employees to transfer to an entity the company knew was doomed. The judgment was unanimous, 9-0. Not a single justice found a defense for what had been done. The logic of that transaction was the same logic that governed Perkins's existence throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s. Concentrate losses where they can be written off, protect the saleable jewel, and keep the option open to sell it when the price is right. Rice understood this. The banks understood this. The trade press understood this. And the workers at Eastfield, reading the same financial pages as everyone else, understood it too. In 1986, the parent was renamed Verity Corporation. The new name was partly inspired by William Verity, whose plough firm had been absorbed by Massey Harris in 1892. Insiders suspected a second inspiration, the initials VAR, Victor A. Rice. Either way, the Massey Ferguson name, which had meant something to every farmer on the planet, was quietly retired from the parent company's masthead. The tractors would still carry it. The corporate entity would not. Through the late 1980s and early 1990s, Perkins continued to expand its product range even as its parent contracted. The acquisition of Rolls-Royce Diesels in Shrewsbury in 1984 and L. Gardner & Sons in Patricroft in 1986 brought additional manufacturing capability and historic brand names under the Perkins umbrella. Dorman Diesels of Stafford was merged in 1990 to form Perkins Engines, Stafford Linteed. By 1992, Perkins was making around 400,000 engines a year across 15 countries, a figure that sat in surreal contrast to the ongoing slow-motion disintegration of the company that owned it. Chapter 8. The Convergence. The endgame began in 1994. In July of that year, Verity completed the sale of the Massey Ferguson tractor business, the division that had started everything, the reason Perkins had been acquired in the first place, to AGCO Corporation of Duluth, Georgia, for $310 million in cash and 500,000 shares of AGCO common stock. The combined value, depending on where you mark the AGCO shares at close, came to roughly $328 million. The tractors were gone. The Massey Ferguson name went with them. What remained inside Verity was Perkins, Kelsey Hayes Brakes, and a collection of automotive component businesses that had nothing to do with diesel engines and everything to do with the next deal Rice was already assembling. That deal arrived in August 1996. Verity merged with Lucas Industries of Birmingham, the automotive electrical and aerospace giant, to form Lucas Verity plc with Rice as chief executive. The The merger created a diversified automotive and aerospace conglomerate with a turnover measured in billions. Perkins was briefly rebadged Varity Perkins, a name that nobody inside the company loved and nobody outside it recognized. Lucas Varity immediately shut Gardner's Barton Hall Motorworks in Eccles, a closure that erased one of Manchester's most storied engineering names and signalled to anyone paying attention that this was a conglomerate interested in automotive brakes and aerospace components, not in the off-highway diesel engines that were Perkins's reason for existing. By 1997, Peterborough employment had contracted to about 4,000, down from the mid-1970s peak of roughly 10,500. 6,500 jobs gone in 20 years, not through one announcement, not through a single closure, through the slow, grinding arithmetic of parent company restructuring, of short-time working and voluntary redundancy and early retirement, and the quiet departure of people who could see which way the numbers pointed and decided to leave before the numbers made the decision for them. The critical point, and the one that separates this story from a dozen other British industrial tragedies, is that nobody in the trade press was predicting that Eastfield would close. The danger was not bankruptcy. The danger was something quieter, something harder to dramatize but no less fatal over time: strategic neglect. Perkins was a profitable off-highway diesel manufacturer trapped inside an automotive and aerospace conglomerate that had no expertise in off-highway diesel, no interest in the capital-intensive emissions research that European and American regulators were about to demand, and no reason to keep the operation beyond its resale value. Rice himself understood this with a clarity that bordered on confession. The on-highway and off-highway sectors of the diesel engine business are converging, he said publicly, driven largely by progressive emissions legislation. Perkins has a limited on-highway presence, whereas Caterpillar is a full-line engine producer. The translation was simple. Stage 3 and Tier 3 emissions regulations were coming. The research and development bill to meet them would run into hundreds of millions. Lucas Varity could not justify that investment for a subsidiary that didn't fit its portfolio. Either Perkins found an owner that ate, slept and breathed diesel engines, or it would slowly atrophy, starved not of orders, but of the investment required to keep its engines legal in the markets where those orders originated. The workforce knew it, the trade press knew it, and somewhere in Peoria, Illinois, a company that had been buying Perkins engines for years and putting them into its own generator sets was doing its own arithmetic and arriving at a number. Chapter 9. Coming Home to Engines. On Thursday, the 11th of December 1997, Caterpillar Incorporated of Peoria, Illinois, announced that it would acquire Perkins Engines from Lucas Varity for $1.325 billion US, £803 million at the December 1997 exchange rate. The deal closed on the 27th of February 1998. The price itself was the first signal that this was not an asset strip. You do not pay £800 million for a company you intend to close. You pay £800 million for a company you intend to run. Donald V. Feitz, Caterpillar's chairman and chief executive, put it in the language of a manufacturer who understood what he was buying. The combination of Caterpillar and Perkins enhances our strategic position in the worldwide engine business and allows us to compete with other full-line producers. Richard L. Thompson, Caterpillar's group president, was more specific. Perkins's product line of 200 horsepower and smaller engines is an outstanding complement to Caterpillar's engine business. As a long-time customer of Perkins Engines, we know them well. They did. Caterpillar's joint venture F.G. Wilson Generators in Larne, Northern Ireland, had been using Perkins 1000 series engines exclusively for years. Caterpillar wasn't buying a stranger. It was buying a supplier it had already tested to destruction. Michael Bourton, the managing director who'd steered Perkins through the Lucas Varity years, was quoted in the announcement with the careful optimism of a man who'd spent too long watching his company get passed between owners who didn't understand it. "I'm extremely pleased with this combination," he said, "which will bring together complementary technology and engine business expertise to enable Perkins and Caterpillar to serve customers and grow in ways neither of us could otherwise." Bourton, a mechanical engineer by training who'd come to Perkins via Tenneco and Walker Manufacturing, would go on to serve as president of the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders in 2002 and was awarded a CBE in 2004. He'd earned it. Holding a profitable company together while three successive parent companies tried to decide whether to invest in it or sell it, is a particular kind of leadership, and not one that generates many headlines. But the voice that captured the mood at Eastfield most precisely belonged to Marion King, Perkins's European PR manager, who told Commercial Motor magazine on the 18th of December, 1997. The feeling here is one of excitement. We're coming back to a company that understands engines. Coming back to a company that understands engines. 9 words that contain the entire relief of a workforce that had spent nearly 2 decades wondering whether its parent company knew or cared what a diesel engine was for. Commercial Motors' own assessment, published the same week, was the cleanest statement of what the deal meant. The price suggests that this is no asset-stripping exercise, and there is no suggestion that any of the sites will close. The 3 UK sites, Peterborough, Stafford, Shrewsbury, had a combined 4,800 employees at acquisition. Victor Rice's role in the transaction completed a circle that had taken 17 years to close. The chimney sweep's son from Hitchin, who'd run the numbers at Perkins in the 1970s, who'd been thrust into the wreckage of Massey Ferguson's collapse, who'd restructured and renamed and merged and divested his way through Project Sunshine and Project Sunshine D2 and the Varity rebrand and the Lucas Varity merger, had finally delivered the one outcome that everyone at Eastfield had been waiting for. He'd found an owner who wanted the company for what it actually did. Chapter 10. The motto, still, reads, "The Caterpillar acquisition did not deliver a fairy tale. It delivered something more valuable, a future built on the understanding that diesel engines are what this factory exists to produce, and that the investment required to keep producing them would come from an owner capable of writing the checks." Peterborough became Caterpillar's European Centre of Excellence for engines under 200 horsepower. The Eastfield site, still sitting at Frank Perkins Way, PE1 5FQ, still occupying roughly 125,000 square metres on the eastern edge of the city, received a succession of investment programmes that Caterpillar, in its standard corporate fashion, declined to attach a single headline figure to. What can be documented is the product, the 1200 series, launched in 2013, a 4.4 to 7 litre family, capable of 75 to 275 horsepower and compliant with Stage 3B, Tier 4, and eventually Stage 5 emissions regulations. The 904 series, branded Perkins Synchro, launched at the Bauma Trade Fair in 2016 in 1.7, 2.2, 2.8 and 3.6 litre variants. The 400 series, a compact 2, 3 and 4-cylinder family covering 10 to 50 kilowatts. Each engine family represented years of research and development and hundreds of millions of pounds in tooling, testing and certification, the kind of investment that Lucas Varity could never have justified and Varity before it could never have afforded. The Peterborough site now houses Caterpillar's Europe Research and Development Centre, with 20 test cells validating engines up to 7.1 litres. The Industrial Power Systems Division is headquartered there, developing embedded controls and hybrid powertrains. In late 2023, Perkins led Project Coeus, an £11.14 million UK government co-funded hybrid powertrain research programme headquartered at Eastfield. In April 2023, then Prime Minister Rishi Sunak toured the factory floor, helping fit air and pressure sensors to a Caterpillar C4.4 engine and calling Peterborough an excellent example of world-class manufacturing here in the UK. A 1.36 megawatt photovoltaic array on site now provides the equivalent of 100% of the factory's base electrical load. By the company's own count, Perkins passed 22 million engines cumulatively produced in 2022, its 90th anniversary. Production capacity at Peterborough runs up to 420,000 diesel engines per year. These are real numbers from a real factory making real things. And yet, current employment at Peterborough runs around 2,500, down from 10,500 at the mid-1970s peak, down from 4,800 across the 3 UK sites at the time of the Caterpillar acquisition. Glassdoor and Indeed Reviews catalogue 3 large redundancy exercises in the last 10 years. In late 2024, the company opened a fresh consultation on roughly 100 further positions, framed in corporate language as positioning for long-term sustainable growth. The workforce at Eastfield today is a quarter of what it was when Stephen Parry's Brazilian colleague called it La Familia Perkins. This is not a betrayal. Caterpillar did not strip the factory. Caterpillar invested in it, developed it, and kept it open, when the alternative, moving engine production to lower-cost facilities in Asia or Latin America, as a dozen other multinationals had done with a dozen other British factories, was available at every board meeting for the past 26 years. The engines are better, the emissions are cleaner, the research capability is deeper, the factory is still there, but 2,500 is not 10,500, and the sports ground on Newark Road is a memory, and the Queen Street works where the Vixen first fired was demolished in the late 1970s to make way for the Queensgate Shopping Centre, opened in 1982 by Queen Beatrix of the Netherlands. A blue plaque on the wall, the only physical reminder that the world's first practical high-speed diesel engines were built on that spot. The original ironworks, where Frank Perkins hung his hat and Charles Chapman heated combustion caps in a coke stove, is now a retail concourse. The cutting fluid smell is gone. The floor doesn't vibrate. The particular hum of hundreds of engines in various stages of test and assembly has been replaced by the sound of shoppers, which is a different kind of economy, but not the kind that makes a man say 30 years later, with complete precision, "I can still smell it." Chapter 11. Where There Is No Vision. The Perkins Long Service Club still meets. Its Diamond Jubilee was celebrated in 2022. The annual dinner is held in May. Cliff Gillis manages the membership. Bill Guest led a strategic review in 2024. The threshold for membership was lowered from 15 years service to 10 at the 2025 AGM. A pragmatic adjustment in a workforce where careers are shorter than they were in the age of La Familia, but a statement nonetheless. The thread is thinner, but it hasn't broken. The Perkins Retired Employees Club meets monthly at the Peterborough and District Indoor Bowls Centre. The Heritage Group, chaired for years by Marketing Director Nigel Baisley, with the historian David Bolton as its long-serving archivist, maintains a working collection of historic engines, loans them to museums, and answers inquiries from enthusiasts who've never set foot in Peterborough but have spent a lifetime listening to the particular note of a 4.236 underload. For the 75th anniversary tour in 2007, a German farmer rode his 1950s Massey Ferguson all the way from Germany to Peterborough, simply to attend. He didn't speak much English. He didn't need to. The engine spoke for itself. Steve Ferguson, no relation to the tractor company, has served as president of Perkins Engines since the 1st of June 2018, holding the role of Caterpillar vice president simultaneously. Rob Walker manages the Peterborough facility. The engines that leave Eastfield today carry designations, 400 series, 904 series, 1200 series, that would mean nothing to a man who once bolted Aeroflow combustion caps onto a Vixen by hand in a derelict Queen Street ironworks. But they solved the same problem Chapman solved in 1932, how to ignite diesel fuel reliably, cleanly, and fast enough to power whatever machine the customer needs powered. The combustion window has tightened from 1,000th of a second to something measured in millionths. The principle is the same. Drive east out of Peterborough on the dual carriageway named after the founder, and you'll pass the Eastfield site on your left. The buildings are modern now. Clean lines, photovoltaic panels, the quiet hum of a factory that's been invested in rather than abandoned. The motto is still carved above the entrance. Where there is no vision, the people perish. It was there when Frank Perkins opened the works in 1947. It was there when Massey Ferguson bought the company in 1959. It was there through Project Sunshine and the Varity rebrand, and the Lucas Varity merger, and the long, anxious years when nobody knew who would own the factory next, or whether the next owner would care. It was there on the morning of the 12th of December, 1997, when the workforce arrived to the news that Caterpillar had agreed to pay £803 million for the right to keep making engines in the city where the diesel revolution began. 22 million engines, 94 years, 2 men in 2 rooms with £10,000 and a coke stove, and a belief that a diesel engine could be made to do what every other engineer in Europe said was impossible. The building still stands, the engines still ship, the motto still reads, and somewhere within a mile of you, right now, a Perkins engine is running. You just can't hear it over the sound of everything else. But it's there. It was always there.